Okay. And so, yes, welcome everybody. My name is Ebony Hooper Boateng. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for St. Louis Recast. And we are super excited to welcome you this afternoon to our webinar series, June series, that's kicking off today, all about amplifying your impact. And today we'll be focusing on reimagining community engagement. But before we dive deeper into that, I want to introduce a few people that have joined us today. With us is also my colleague and Recast Program Manager, Paula Sutherland. She is waving there. And then Recast, although our internal staff is small, we definitely have a powerful infrastructure behind the scenes supporting us on a systems level. And with that, we have a core advisory board that's made up of several different influential entities throughout St. Louis region. And several of them are on the call today, and some of which you will hear from later this afternoon. And so each month we meet collectively and they provide insight. And so it's really cool because if you're familiar with St. Louis, some of those organizations are representing Washington University, the United Way, St. Louis Mental Health Board, St. Louis City Department of Health, just to name a few. And I know the ones I didn't say are going to be like, what about me? But it's okay. And so we're super ecstatic to have you all here. And we definitely are excited to have our community members here who are influential to St. Louis Recast. For those who don't know, Recast stands for Resiliency in Communities After Stress and Trauma. And it's a 5-year grant that was awarded to the St. Louis County Department of Public Health in 2016. So yes, we are in that 5th year, but it's really centered on empowering the community by centering the community and allowing them to allocate how our different grant funds are spent in their community to award projects in the areas of violence prevention, youth engagement, peer support, and I've missed one. I'm so sorry. Peer support and mental health. And so with that being said, we really utilize participatory budgeting to do that, but we'll be talking more specifically about that later this afternoon. And now I want to shift gears to introduce our guest speaker who will really dive in, because before we really seek to engage the community, we first as organizations and stakeholders have some internal work that we need to do first to make sure that we're really prepared to engage communities in an equitable way when they do come to us. And so with that said, I would like to now introduce our guest speaker, Rachel. Rachel is a proud lifelong resident of St. Louis, sorry. She was born to parents who immigrated to the US from India, and Rachel has always been passionate about bringing differences and celebrating what's possible when we collaborate from a mindset of abundance, learning, and risk taking. She is the founder of Gladiator Consulting, which provides a holistic approach to nonprofit organizational capacity building. Through Gladiator, Rachel has combined her knowledge of organizational culture and resource development with her deep personal commitment to centering community, seeking justice, and creating belonging for those who have been disenfranchised or are targeted by institutions, systems, and policies. And so with no further ado, I'm going to pass it to Rachel to talk more about bringing equity to resource development, leading through community-centric fundraising.
Thank you, Ebony. I'm so glad to be here. And it's always funny when people read my bio because I'm like, I'm Cameron and Amelia Seberg's driver. Like I'm their personal assistant. I forget that I do all this other work. Okay, let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Oh, I cannot share my screen. Okay, you have to unshare yours. Here we go. All right, I'm gonna try to set my computer up so I can at least see some of y'all while we're talking here. There we go. Okay. So we are going to spend some time talking about community-centric fundraising and resource development in the nonprofit sector this afternoon. Some of this might be new to you all. Some of it might be things you've heard before and you have additional questions. So I don't want you to feel like you just have to listen to me blather on for 30 or 45 minutes. If you have any questions that you want to drop in the chat, I'll be keeping my eye there, but I am going to run through a very specific set of information. So Ebony told you who I am. These are some of the consultants I work with, and this is my sweet family, some of whom you might see behind me at some point during the talk. We'll see what happens. And here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about we're going to do a quick history review of how philanthropy has evolved in the United States. We're going to talk about the difference between models and movements. I'm going to share a little bit about the current community-centric fundraising movement and how we bring this movement to life when we are in the nonprofit sector, looking for every resource we can to be able to benefit the communities that we work with and the communities that we serve. So again, as I said, feel free as I get going to drop your questions and comments in the chat, and I will pause periodically to address them. I also will be sharing a resource list with Ebony after the fact. So anything that I mention in the talk, you will get the links to the websites or those resources. So don't worry if you miss something like that. So we're going to start with a history lesson. And with that, we are going to think about the meaning of philanthropy. So at its root, philanthropy means the love of humankind. The first time that the word or the concept was used was back in 500 BCE. So this idea, right, that we can be kind and share resources amongst our community members, amongst our neighbors and family, has been around for literal millennia. It changed, it got co-opted essentially by Christianity in the 1500s, where it started to take on a meaning that was related to money. And that if you were an individual who had been blessed, who had had the opportunity to amass a fortune, you were encouraged essentially by God to share those resources within your community. And so up until that point, and even as the United States was being colonized, you had the spirit of philanthropy sort of present everywhere in that, when different groups of colonizers or immigrants came over, when we look at the indigenous populations, people were used to sharing resources. They were sharing access to education. They were building hospitals and sharing access to healthcare. They were sharing food. Families were sharing housing. There is nothing necessarily new about philanthropy. What changed is the idea that philanthropy is organized around money. This starts to get a little more extreme when we start to get into the late 1800s and the early 1900s, and we see specifically in the United States, white Christian land-owning men start to experience great financial success during the Industrial Revolution. And so in that period of time, if you've gone down this road in history, you will learn that there were pretty abusive forms of capitalism, and things that are not capital. Things are worse than capitalism. They get a different name. I'm not sure, but there were crappy models of economic structures that allowed people to amass great wealth while violating, the human rights of people. And that is how this wealth was built, essentially. And in the early 1900s, our friend here, the bottom right square, Andrew Carnegie, he authored a document that is known today as the Gospel of Wealth. And in this letter, he sent it to all of his rich friends. He essentially said that if you have money, you are required to invest in the community in a way that makes you feel good, right? So we have to give back, but we also want to feel good about what we do. So one of the things that Andrew Carnegie is responsible for when we look at our modern day communities is the public library system. So he invested his wealth all over the country to build what we experience now as modern day libraries, public libraries. We also live with the environmental legacy of the Industrial Revolution. So one of the things that we understand that came out of this massive period of wealth building was that, yes, as a private citizen, we do feel that we have a responsibility to ameliorate some of the things that we experience in community, but they didn't always acknowledge that they were causing problems as they were acquiring this wealth. So as this period happened in the early 1900s and individuals began to amass this wealth, the United States government said, well, we need to tax that, right? And so you start to see right after World War I, tax policies around personal income tax and things like that. And these individuals who had amassed resources were trying to figure out, well, how do I keep my wealth where I want it to go, right? And so in 1954, we finally see the birth of what we now know as the modern day 501c3, as well as other 501 nonprofit designations come to life. So I share all of this with you to essentially remind our community that the laws that govern nonprofit organizations were not created for nonprofit organizations to be successful. They were not created to meet the needs of the community. They were created as a shelter for wealth for people who wanted to make sure that they had control of their money. I'm gonna let that sit with you for a second, right? We're all in this work. If you are like me, you're busting your butt every day to try to bring good stuff into our community, to try to believe in abundance of resources, to try to leverage a community asset-based mindset. And we're working within a system that was not created for us to be successful. It was created as a way to start creating tax deductions and other benefits to people with wealth. So that is what happens in 1954. When we look at the last, 70 or so years, we start to see a few things happening over the course of time. As the civil rights movement began to take up more space in the media and in the hearts and minds of people, we start to see government trying to respond in a way, making space for more identities, for more supports for individuals living and thriving in the United States. And then we get to the 80s and we see a great shrinking of that. And so as government starts to become smaller, you start to see the nonprofit social safety net explode. I want to say, and this could be the sort of wrong terminology, but in the St. Louis region alone, there's nearly 13,000 nonprofit organizations registered with the Secretary of State's office. 13,000, you guys. I like that number, it just blows my mind. Because all of these people, right, start to scramble to figure out if we cannot rely on policy and systems to take care of us, what do we need to introduce into our community that is going to do what is needed for our communities to thrive, for us to experience generational growth and success, and for us to change the trajectories of different communities across our region, right? So we hear from our friend Darren Walker here in the blue suit, who is currently the executive director and CEO of the Ford Foundation. In 2015, he authored Towards a New Gospel of Wealth. I love this man. If I ever meet him, I'm going to embarrass myself because I will be a fangirl. I would encourage you to Google Towards a New Gospel of Wealth, though I will obviously share that link with Ebony as well. But in this, he starts to connect the dots between how resources have been kept from communities and what people with resources need to do in terms of mutual aid, in terms of economic development, and in terms of essentially reparations to start a different conversation about how we think about our resources in the community. And so he really challenges philanthropy to step away from an idea of harm reduction and really start to look at how do we change systems. And philanthropy is real scared of that. I'm going to tell you that right now. When they think of systems, they think of government. There are some things that they want to leave to government. And Darren Walker essentially starts to argue, actually, we all have a role to play in the improvement of our communities and the lifting up of our community members, and philanthropy can no longer abdicate their seat at the table. So look it up. It's great. Also, he recently, if you're a 60 Minutes fan, he recently did an interview on 60 Minutes. So you don't even have to read. You can listen to him tell it to you. It's really wonderful. So we've seen that happening. And then we have something very curious that has started to occur, which is the rise of philanthrocapitalism. So as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of IRS governed structures in which people can give money away, in which people can make decisions. And there are rules, right? There are rules about transparency. There are rules about tax benefits. There are rules about who you can give money to, how much money you can give away, all these things. There are some mega wealthy people, and I will offer up organizations like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative or the Emerson Collective or the Omidyar Network. So these are organizations that give away large sums of money, but they do it as an LLC. So these are private citizens who are putting their own privately earned dollars into an LLC, into a for-profit business structure, and they are giving that money away. They are stepping away from the tax benefits of giving that money away. But as a for-profit business, they are not beholden to the transparency laws that we see governing operating foundations. So keep a lookout, because I suspect in the next few years, we're going to see some policy shifts around who organizations are allowed to accept money from and what benefits can or can't happen from that. So just tuck that in the back of your head. So I say all of this to get us to now, this sort of mid-COVID, second chapter of COVID, act 3 of COVID, wherever we are, right? In this uncertain world where we have been asked essentially over the course of the last, 18 months to reimagine our existence, reimagine our resources, reimagine our relationships, how we are in community with people. And when we think about the fundraising world, there's been a prevailing model of how we access resources. And is this familiar to folks? You can give me a little thumbs up or a thumbs down, anything like that, or drop some thoughts in the chat. But over the course of, I would say, probably the last 3 decades, the idea in the fundraising world has been, if we do what donors tell us to do, if we treat donors the way that we think that they want to be treated, we will make the money we need to drive the change we see in our communities. So I got to ask you a question. Has anybody who practiced donor-centered fundraising solved the problem, and has your nonprofit gone out of business because you got enough money to do the thing and now we don't need you anymore? Probably not, right? This model has been talked about as if it is a transformational model. And really, it maintains the power structures in our communities and puts a lot of power in the hands of the people with financial resources, a lot of the say about things. And as you can tell by the name, it does not center the community or stakeholders in the work that is being done. So last summer, time is irrelevant. Yes, it was last summer, July of 2020, a group of Black, Indigenous, and people of color fundraisers in Seattle launched what they're calling a community-centric fundraising movement. And the community-centric fundraising movement asks us to think about our resources a little differently. It essentially doesn't say, donor-centered fundraising is wrong, right? We still need to be kind to people. We still need to thank them for their gifts. We still need to have relationships with them. But we can't take cues from our donors. when the community has the lived experience to tell us what they need and how we can support them. And so it is a model that invites us to consider a different way to access resources where the end game is not harm reduction. And harm reduction is not bad, right? We want backpacks. We want people to get food. We want people to have coats in the winter. We want harm reduction, but it's also asking us to look at systems change. It's also asking our organization to say, what does it look like for us to put ourselves out of business because we solved the problem? What does it look like for our advocacy to move us beyond, food insecurity to like solving problems in our food system, right? This is a lot for fundraisers. I was a baby fundraiser once upon a time, longer ago than I would care to admit. And I remember, right, my goal was like, you got to bring in this amount of money this month because we gotta do our next project. And I don't care about justice. I don't care about this. We need to pay our bills so we can do this, right? We need to keep the lights on. And that's all wonderful and great. And that's something that every fundraiser has probably heard. But it has not been, I would say over the last 30 years, a cornerstone of this work to ask people who are raising funds to also be in relationship with members of the community. And I think that's where this model for me has started to shift and transform the way that I think I can contribute to and sort of give my highest and best value to advance the St. Louis community for everybody that lives here. So in community-centric fundraising, there are sort of 10 basic principles. And I'm not going to read these to you, but you can there's a community-centric fundraising.org website that has both this information along with tons of resources and content for us to start thinking through what this looks like. This is by no means a ceiling and should not be treated as such. This is very much the ground floor of what is possible when we start to think about using our resources in a different way, taking our cues from community and listening to the people with lived experience. So ultimately, I know you've seen this picture a gajillion times. Ultimately, the goal is liberation, right? Like I dream of putting myself out of a job. In addition to what Ebony shared, that I'm the founder and principal of Gladiator Consulting, I also am the primary fundraising person for the nonprofit organization Forward Through Ferguson. I would love to have raised so much money for that organization that I have fixed the problems in this community and I can, drink my lemonade and read my magazine and watch my Netflix and take my kids to the zoo. I would love that, right? And we are not liberated. And it takes all of us to make different decisions to move into a space where we don't need nonprofit organizations to support our community because we have solved the problems, right? So I share all of this stuff and these are the questions that I get. Like, all of this sounds really great and you sound like a special snowflake and this is lovely, but like, we have hard work to do. We have people that need things right now. I have to raise this money. Like, my board's not going to sign up for this. Like, all of this, I hear all of this. And so I like to bring real examples to the conversation so you guys know that I know what I'm talking about when I share that this is possible. So I'm going to walk through a couple examples of local organizations that are doing this work, and then we're going to have time for you to ask questions or make your comments or offer how some of this has shown up in your work. I would sort of love to hear what you all have going on. So principle number 1, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. The example that I offer here is an organization called Generate Health. They have been known in a couple of different names. I think they were at one point the Maternal and Family Health Coalition, something very long, and now they're Generate Health. But back in probably 2016 or 2017, they got the results of some local data back that they found really troubling. And that was when they looked at the maternal infant mortality rates of moms and babies in the St. Louis region. They were historically low, which is wonderful. But when they disaggregated that data by race, they realized that that drop primarily happened with white moms and white babies, and that the maternal infant mortality rates for Black moms and Black babies had tripled over this period of time. And so their organization had a choice to make. Do we continue to talk about moms and babies, or do we center our work on Black moms and Black babies? And so back in 2017, their board of directors made the decision, we need to change our mission, and we need to change our vision, and we need to change our organization, because we know that until we've gotten this figured out for Black moms and Black babies, people across the region are going to continue to suffer. And so with that decision, they realized it can't just be that our mission and vision have changed. It has to be that we begin to shift our perspectives on who we are taking money from, who we are asking for resources from, and where we are challenging the way that money and power has shown up in the community. So Generate Health is a great organization to check out. And they're very active. If you're social media people, they're very active on the social media. So you should definitely take a look at their social handles. I'm going to peek at the chat real quick to see if oh, thank you. Yes, Maternal, Child, and Family Health Coalition. Thank you for that. Okay. So the next examples that I'll give, these are the two of the principles tied in together, are individual organizational missions are not as important as the collective community, and nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. I have to admit that sometimes when I read these, I laugh, because if there's one thing that St. Louis is good at, it's silos. We love silos. We love to reinvent the wheel. We love to get mad at so-and-so organization who's doing the thing we said we were going to do in that grant application. It's exhausting. And this challenges us to think about our work differently. So last year, Forward Through Ferguson held a virtual fundraiser last June. And the goal of it was really sort of a community-oriented event, but it was a fundraiser. They were seeking to raise funds for the organization. Unfortunately, while we were planning this event, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And that resulted in an outpouring of support to the organization that had never happened before. And so we found ourselves having made, I think, in the neighborhood of $150,000 over the course of a couple weeks, which for Forward Through Ferguson is a pretty big deal. They're a tiny organization. And so we're looking at this fundraiser thinking, okay, for the first time in 5 years, we're stable. Like, we don't need more money right now. Like, we can pay our bills. What do we do with this? And the staff and the board made the decision to take the profits from this fundraiser and share them with Action St. Louis, with Dream Builders for Equity, and with the Metro Trans Umbrella Group. We didn't ask those organizations to do any work. We didn't ask them to promote the event. I don't even know that we told them ahead of time that we were giving them this money. We told the people on the call, if you give, just know. But at the end of the day, we had the opportunity to sort of abandon scarcity mindset, because we also love scarcity mindset nonprofit sector, right? We had the option to say, right now we have enough. Which of our organizational partners needs our support now? And they made a decision. And you guys, it wasn't, I think we gave out like $20,000. It was not a ton of money, but it was a different practice. And even today, people are like, are you sure we don't need to do anything about that? It's like, no, like, this is practicing community-centric fundraising. It is an intentional decision that we have to be supportive of each other, and that we have an opportunity to raise up the community over our missions, over our board, over somebody's ego, right? All right, so number 4 and number 5, all who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donors, or board members. And number 5, time is valued equally as money. So locally, we have an organization called the Immigrant Home English Learning Program, or iHelp. They have paid staff that does some curriculum coordination, but the work that this organization does is really about relationship building. And they take volunteers. So I could volunteer. I took French in high school, And when my parents were speaking their native language, they did it to keep secrets from me and my brother. So I am mostly an English only speaker, right? They trained me to be able to go into the home of a person who is newly immigrated or has resettled in the St. Louis region, and help them learn English and help them to navigate the system. So the value in this organization, yes, they want a donation. Yes, it's wonderful to have those funds, but they want people to give of their time so that they can build relationships with people that are new to our community. And so I have said before, like, oh, can I just write you a check? And they're like, no, but I see you have two brothers. Can they volunteer? This is an organization that has found that once they are able to pay their staff, they don't need to continue to ask for money or fundraise. They need to get more people in the door who are willing to build relationships with the people they seek to serve. Okay, we treat donors as partners, and this means that we are transparent, assume the best intentions, and occasionally have difficult conversations. We foster a sense of belonging, not othering. So the organization that I lift up here is We Stories. We Stories is an interesting organization if you've not heard about them. They were founded by two white women to introduce books to children that feature characters of color. So you have mostly white families, or I should center non-Black families, who are reading books from birth through, I think, age 10, and going through a cohort so that white parents can begin to figure out how to talk to their children about both race and anti-racism. One of the things that I appreciate about this organization is these people have hard conversations all the time. If you go on their Facebook page, they call each other out on everything. And it is with the intent to, I shouldn't say call out, I should say call in. They call people into a conversation. They talk about why things have happened. It doesn't matter if I have donated my time. It doesn't matter if I've written a $50,000 check. They are willing to have hard conversations, because if they can't have hard conversations with their donors, how do we expect parents to have hard conversations with their children? And so it is uncomfortable to observe, and it has helped the organization persist and grow in a way that has created stronger relationships between some communities across the region. Okay, number 8, we promote the understanding that everyone, donors, staff, funders, board members, volunteers, personally benefit from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity or compassion. Y'all, it makes me bonkers when donors want to function as a savior. They want to give the resources, they want to swoop in and save the day, and they somehow think that they do not benefit personally from engaging in acts of philanthropy. It drives me bonkers. This is my colleague, Natalie. She used to work for the Kauffman Foundation in Kansas City. And last year, like perhaps on the first day of lockdown, she moved back to St. Louis to take the job as the executive director at STEM STL. One of the first things that she was able to do while she was there is host a webinar for all of her institutional donors. All of her institutional donors are led by white men. And the topic of this engagement was moving boldly towards anti-racism in STEM. Her advisory committee thought she was nuts, if I'm going to be honest. They were terrified that if she tried to have a hard conversation with her donors about justice, about racism in our community, about colorism in our community, that they would lose money. So she invited all of her donors to come. And about 75% of the people that she invited were able to attend. How many people decided to stop giving her money? Nobody. In fact, she had 3 donors that wrote her bigger checks after this event. When we invite our donors into our tough conversations, we give them an opportunity to learn and to build a bigger base for the work that we are doing. I do not want you to write a check if you are not going to vote a certain way, if you are not going to make choices for your children a certain way, if you're not going to put your money in a certain place, right? We have to give them an opportunity to learn. And I can tell you that they're not out there wanting to learn because they're raising their kids and they're going to work and they have their hobbies and they're volunteering for you, right? Like we have to create spaces where it is safe for people to engage in these conversations where we're not going to embarrass them. And some people are going to say some hard stuff. So, on the other side of it, if you facilitate these conversations for your donors, schedule a little self-care day after that, like, take a half day or something. But, when we give people space to learn, we create a stronger bond with our organizations. And then the last two, I really love this example of this. I'm really excited that this happened in our community. But so number 9, we see the work of social justice as a holistic and transformative, not transactional. And we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. So a few years ago, our local Deaconess Foundation and Metropolitan Congregations United, MCU, they partnered together with an organization in New York called RIP Medical Debt to figure out how to purchase the debt of people living and working in the St. Louis community. So Deaconess was able to match the dollars raised by the MCU member congregations. And with a little under $1 million, they were able to buy $12.9 million of medical debt that had gone to collections, right, for people in this community. When we aren't getting our wages garnished, we are able to use our resources in a different way. And this is a huge shift in the way we think about money and resources and where things go. I would love to see more of this happen. I would love for us to think more creatively about our resources, but they were able to serve thousands of people across the community who had medical debt from a deceased parent or who had a situation with their own health where they simply didn't have health insurance covered or they were dealing with a child's illness. And when you give financial freedom to generations, you shift the things that are happening in your community. So I'm going to sort of close this out and then definitely want to have space for questions. But, how do we start? How do we figure out where this work begins? I think the journey is different for everyone. I think there's a different starting point for everyone. But what I would offer is that for me, when I think about my fundraising career, I had to really sit with myself and think about where I have allowed white supremacy culture and white privilege to influence the ways that I show up at work, the ways that I engaged with donors. And that's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to think about the ways in which you've had to behave differently to be successful at work or behave differently to get resources for your organization. So you have to turn that lens inward first. And once you do that, we have an opportunity to start to innovate and start to think about the different ways in which we live our personal core values, we live the values of our organization, and we move forward. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean you're just going to be successful. There's a lot of failure. There's a little bit of discomfort, but my opinion has been with this, if we're not uncomfortable, we're probably not learning. And that's not going to advance your organization's work in the community. The other thing that I would offer here is that there is not a single person I know that has been able to change a system. So we're not by ourselves. We're not the only person in our organization that has to move things forward. We have to figure out who our friends are on the board. We have to figure out who our colleagues are. We need to figure out our peers outside of our organization. And we need to invite the loud naysayers to our table to have a real conversation, right? We can't leave them behind. The change doesn't happen when they're loud at someone else's table, right? So we got to bring them in. We got to hear what they have to say and be willing to have a conversation about it. And then you just start and you go from there. One of the easiest ways that I hear people talk about getting started with community-centric fundraising, is calling their peer organizations and learning about what they have going on or what donors they share, where they're struggling. Once you're willing to start that conversation and start to move that needle just a little bit, it will surprise you where people start to show up in different ways. So anyway, that is it for me. I think we have some time for questions, but I wanted to throw my contact information up here for you as well. You're definitely, anytime you're welcome to email me. I don't believe St. Louis is served by hoarding information or hoarding my time. So anything that I can do or say or share or connect you to that will advance our community, I'm happy to do that. So you can feel free to email me and or, tweet me or go to the website and see what we have going on. So I'll stop sharing my screen and just make a little bit of space for questions or reflections or thoughts, or where this has shown up in your work or where it's been hard for this to happen in your work.
And then, yes, everyone. So as all right, now it's both of us. As feel free to put your questions in the chat box, or if you have a question, definitely feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to actually verbally ask your question. We welcome it. I have a question, Rachel. While we wait a little bit. I know you spoke about, which was fabulous. You spoke a lot about, sometimes organizations may be working from a scarcity standpoint, and things are maybe because of funding have a time frame, once the funding ends and things like that, and they are working around that. What would you say, using the centric model, how can organizations like maintain a presence in the communities that they're seeking to serve beyond their project scope?
Sure.
Or timeline?
So we are working on a project like that right now, where we have a client who received essentially a 10-year grant from a local institution. And they were like, all right, in 10 years, we're not giving you any more money. And, that's a decision that funder has made, but it's not like that money just is going to somehow fall from the sky or materialize to support this work, which now the community has come to know that it happens and is depending on these resources to be organized in this way. And so a couple of things. One of the things that I would offer is circling back with that funder and saying, I understand that your priorities have shifted or the term of this grant has ended, but as a partner to us, as a partner to this work, we need you to leverage the relationships that you have to help us figure out where additional resources or new resources are going to come into play to be able to continue what you started. So that's one piece. Oh, wait, okay, we have another question. Ebony, did that kind of get a little bit at your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And I can go ahead and read. Damon Major asks, do you feel like having that tough conversations come off softer coming from people that look like the donors versus those who don't? He feels that it can come off aggressive for people of color. So what are your thoughts, Rachel?
No, I have definitely had that those feelings of like, oh, I'm going to be the brown person that brings this up again, or in my sphere of influence, everybody talks about like the tiger mom as like an Asian stereotype. So I've definitely heard the like, oh, better watch out, tiger mom's coming. And I'm like, actually, you want to see what she looks like? Like, just call, I do think that is a difficulty. And I think that there's a lot of different ways to have these conversations. And so typically when we're going to start to have difficult conversations, whether it's with our donors, with our board, or with our leadership staff, I try to use a resource or an article or something that is informative and open-ended as the starting point for the conversation. And I try to ask sort of open-ended questions. So there's an interesting article that I really appreciate that was in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. It's called Shifting Philanthropy from Charity to Justice. And it came out in 2017. And it just talks about how the mindset of charity has not served animals, it has not served the environment, it has not served people. And so how do we shift from a charity mindset to a justice mindset when we think about our philanthropic investments? And being able to say, hey, let's read this. I would love to hear about what you think. Position the conversation as an invitation for someone to share with me instead of me being like, let me tell you why everything is messed up. And that has sort of helped open a door. Now, I will also say that I am a 5 foot tall woman. And so even when I am angry or, bring those emotions into a meeting, I might not be intimidating. I might not embody that. And I think that we have an opportunity when we're framing these conversations with donors to bring a set of group norms or values into the conversation at the beginning. So we can say, when a microaggression like that happens, hey, remember that we decided these 10 values were how we were going to frame that conversation. Like what you just did there really is an example of this, right? So what are our rules of engagement with those donors when we go into those conversations? And how do we feel confident? Again, not to call them out, but to call them in and be like, this is an example. Because the other thing that I think comes up for me is as I'm navigating these things, people are so steeped in their own experience that even when we call out a microaggression or an instance of racism, it doesn't click, it doesn't connect. And so if we are going to continue to engage in this work, we have to be a little persistent about how we meet them kind of close where they are. You don't need to meet them all the way where they are. But if we truly believe that we want to bring them along, where do we show up in a conversation in a way that invites them to be open to critique?
Thank you, Rachel. If does anyone have, I'm looking in the chat box. Oh, we do have one more. Paula asks, are you finding organizations are engaging residents to address community needs overall? If so, do you have an example of that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, some of the organizations that come to mind. So Dutchtown South is an organization that I feel like even with their the Grabway Jefferson plan that was created a few years ago, they really are door to door in community with business owners trying to figure out how to advance the economic impact and health of the Dutchtown footprint. I would offer them. I would also offer, I know I referenced them before, but Generate Health. They have a couple different networks of service providers, of moms in the community, of healthcare providers who are really advancing the work. They also manage the Flourish program. Yeah, Paula's nodding her head. So Flourish is a community-oriented grant-making program where they really are relying on the wisdom and lived experience of their community members to distribute resources to organizations that are supportive of, perinatal behavioral health and other health issues in the community. I would also put the Education Equity Center of St. Louis out there. That's the new organization that came out of the Ed Hub network that used to be housed in Venture Cafe. So Sharita Love is over there, and she is with teachers, with educators, with principals, with parents, with students, working to advance different ways of getting our children what they need. But it's not because her board is telling her what to do. It's because she's in classrooms and she's with teachers. I think that it really is, honestly, Paula, the grassroots organizations, of course, that are in, contact and communication with their community members. I am hopeful and have told him as such that now that Dr. Jason Purnell is at BJC, that we start to see some of our large nonprofit institutions who function like a for-profit start to take actual cues from the communities that they are living in, the communities that they employ, the communities that they are making their money off of. And I suspect that he will start to advance those relationships in a different way.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you.
Of course.
And thank you everyone for all of the questions. And as Rachel mentioned, she's gonna share a resource list that we will send out to everyone along with the recording, and that will be shared to everyone present as well as all those who registered or are watching this replay. So thank you so much, Rachel.
Of course. Thanks for having me. And like I said, I threw my contact information up there. Please don't hesitate to email me. And if you don't email me, then you can't be mad when I'm not helpful to you. So please ask. I am always happy to show up for folks.
Thank you.
Of course.
And so that was really awesome. And the last piece there really is a great segue for the next portion of our webinar this afternoon. And so Rachel shared a lot, about the importance of community-centered fundraising and sort of that internal work that organizations should do, and also how that translates to how we begin to really work with our communities. Because as an organization, it's twofold, it's more levels to it. And so one of the ways that St. Louis Recast has been doing that, as I mentioned earlier, is through participative approaches, which we really center participatory budgeting to be specific. And so several things that Rachel mentioned throughout her presentation really coincides with our 4 pillars for our sustainability efforts. And so if you remember, I said we are in that 5th year of our grant, and the pillars that we are really focusing on as far as sustainability goes is economic mobility, which is one of the things that she really mentioned, and the importance of that. Also, another thing that she really honed in on was, system connections and how important the systemic changes and, coming together and utilizing our resources and not working in those different silos, how important that is to really come together and connect to better serve the community. A third pillar of that is also community networks and organization. And so building that capacity through so that organizations are better capable to, advance and serve the community and network to be able to connect and really build those connections to really strengthen and amplify that impact. And then fourth there, which is what we will be talking about the rest of this afternoon, is operationalizing participatory budgeting. And so in that work group is myself, and then also from our core advisory board, Shamika Davis, who works with St. Louis County Department of Public Health, as well as Craig Schmidt from the St. Louis City Department of Health. And so we are going to be presenting a little skit that we worked on, but to give a little context before I play the skit, I want to share just a little bit about what exactly participatory budgeting is, so that you can have a good understanding of that. And so really briefly, I'm gonna share my screen. And so, yes, so on your recast again uses participatory budgeting as a model to allocate funds into the community. And so it's really driven by the community letting us know what the needs are and centering community voice in that process. And so, simply put, participatory budgeting is a democratic process in which community members directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. And so it's really using real money to help decide how funds will be spent and letting the community have that equitable interaction and representation, and really shifts the traditional model of how traditionally how that's done. And it began in 1989 in Brazil and has since spread all around the world, and even making its way and showing up here in our region in St. Louis, Missouri. And so, simply put, kind of what is the process? And this is also true of what the recast process is. There isn't necessarily one single approach, but in general, community members come together to design community projects. They also have a say in reviewing proposals that come in. To implement those projects, and the community at large gets to vote on those different ideas and projects to decide what should be implemented in their community. And then those funds are allocated into the community to bring those projects to life. And so on your screen, there's a picture of recast. We have done this process, and here's just a picture to put some faces to show the representation of the community. We work with the St. Louis Promise Zone, which is parts of St. Louis, North St. Louis City and North St. Louis County. And so with that being said, a lot of times, it sounds really cool, and we get asked, how can my organization do this? How can we make this shift to allocating our funds in this really community-centered way? And so, with no further ado, I would like to show our Oscar award-winning skit, and then we'll open up for questions and comments at the end. All right. Now, hopefully I don't have any. Oh, well, one moment here. I have a backup just in case.
Hi, Ebony. Are you ready for today's meeting with Craig?
Yes, I'm really looking forward to it. It's so exciting to see organizations' interest in participatory budgeting growing. And I just really hope that we're able to answer all his questions about how his organization can get started. Oh, look, Craig is already on the call. Hey, Craig.
Well, good afternoon. I'm trying to yell as out as I can. I'm here in the ballpark, but I've been trying to get hold of you gurus to learn more about Recast, that process, so that my organization can implement something similar. I know our time is limited, so I'll dive right in if that's okay by you with some questions.
Yes.
Well, I heard from Ebony, and I think I have a better understanding of what participatory budgeting is. But what are some of the benefits, and why did you all decide to do this process, Shamika?
Yes. So we decided to do a participatory budgeting process because it is a trauma-informed approach that centers community. It's returning democratic capacity back to the community. Typically, we elect people to do budgeting, but this involves everyone directly in the process. And some benefits are that it really promotes transparency, accountability, and the importance of civic engagement.
So do we need a big staff to do all of that? What are some of the key internal roles that we might need to implement this process, Ebony?
That's a really good question, Craig. So I would say some of the key players would be first and foremost to have a program manager or somebody that's really kind of overseeing the entire program, that can focus on the overall budget, interacting with stakeholders and things of that nature. And then also having someone that's dedicated to community outreach and being that liaison between you all and the community members and helping plan all those different community events. Those would probably be the most two important internal roles. If your organization has the capacity, then also maybe having people that can really help facilitate those community meetings. But you could also partner with people to do that if you don't have those people actually on your team. And then it could also be really helpful to have like an advisory board that can help provide feedback along the way. But of course, making sure that the community that you're seeking to serve is involved and represented.
Well, this all sounds great, but does it take a lot of money and time? What does that timeline look like, and how much money do you think we need for this process, Ebony?
Oh, yes. So for the money, I would say that would really depend on your organization's capacity. So, the type of projects that you all are trying to be able to fund or services that you're trying to be able to fund, and just kind of how big of the process it will be will determine how much money is needed. But for the timeline for St. Louis Recast is really a year-long process that repeats itself each year. And so kind of if we broke it down, we use about 4 to 6 months to plan and design the process, and then the remaining 6 months to actually carry it out. So with the community, it typically takes about a month or two to collect ideas and have those meetings. And then we use about another month or so to turn them into professional proposals. And then another 2 months to actually plan, promote, and eventually host the community voting for all residents to come out. But another piece to take into consideration, for Recast, we actually are awarding dollars to other organizations to implement those community projects. So if you're going to be doing that, then you'll also want to incorporate 2 to 3 months to be able to receive those proposals and evaluate them as well.
Well, and when you were talking about working with the community on a couple month basis, is that meeting with them weekly?
Yes.
Okay. So what if we're not able to do this full process?
Oh, yes. So, really kind of the beauty with PB is that it really incorporates several different participative approaches. And so each of them are really powerful on their own. And so when we think about engagement on like a spectrum, the community can be involved in providing their feedback, whether it's through surveys or focus groups or community meetings. And then also too, another thing maybe community members can be a part of is reviewing proposals that come in and providing feedback there. They can be involved. Maybe it's just the community voting piece at the end that they're involved in. And if they aren't able to actually maybe create the community projects, because maybe you already know what you can actually do with the money, but community could still be involved with prioritizing those different areas that you'll be able to fund.
So Ebony, I think you've told us about the logistics, the internal logistics, and I'd like to switch gears a bit. And if we can discuss with Shamika, how do we get the community involved? What does that recruitment piece look like?
Yes, so there were a variety of ways that we did recruitment work that included using social media, attending community events, as well as hosting community events, going to churches, council meetings, schools, grocery stores. We just really went to where the people are to raise awareness about this initiative. Community residents who wanted to be a part of this participatory budgeting process were able to apply to become a community delegate. In order to apply, there was no experience that was needed. And we use this as an opportunity to build capacity, which is an important part of sustainability. We offer training such as facilitative leadership, trauma-informed care, racial equity, proposal evaluation, and other incentives such as compensation, childcare, and transit passes.
So once you have them all there, what's actually discussed during those community meetings, Shamika?
Yes, so community meetings take place over 4 weeks. Each week builds upon the previous week. There are facilitators who lead the community meetings, and the community meetings are focused on the 4 funding priority areas, including youth engagement, violence prevention, mental health, and peer support. Throughout the time that the community delegates meet, they decide and come to a consensus on what would be the target audience for the service, what would be the desired service and or project to be implemented, what is the experience that the organization who is applying will need, and also performance measures.
So frequently at these meetings, you see the same people, but there are folks whose voices are often not heard well enough. So we'd like in our organization to have some non-traditional voices heard and represented in these meetings, particularly youth, because they're so important for the future of our community and the development that's occurring. Can you speak about your experience and some tips for engaging youth in this process?
Yes, so youth for St. Louis Recast, youth beginning at the age 11 are able to be community delegates. They will need parental consent to be a community delegate. Throughout the time of attending community delegate meetings, youth provide their wisdom, they give tangible examples, input on the services that are being provided. Some facilitator tips that we have learned throughout this process is using a round robin approach. So making sure that everyone's voice is included. Often there are times where we may say, well, we've heard from a lot of adults, but at this time we would like to hear some perspectives from our youth, and also knowing and engaging the youth, not only inside of the community delegate meetings, but it's also important to build that rapport outside of the meetings as well.
I see. Wow. That's great. So over the years, Ebony, how many residents have participated and how many contracts were awarded?
Oh, yes. So, Craig, we've actually done 4 rounds of PB. And so over those 4 different processes, there's been a total of 209 community residents across the St. Louis Promise Zone that have participated as community delegates. So they were involved in either creating those community projects or reviewing proposals that came in from organizations. And of those 209 delegates, 53 were youth ages 11 to 24. And so that is really cool. And then we also make sure, our community voting, it really opens up the process and gets more people involved so that regardless of if they've participated, they can still come out and vote. So over the 4 years, 700 a little bit over 700 residents have actually participated in community voting, which has resulted in 31 different contracts being awarded, reflecting 17 different local organizations here.
Well, you all have done this for a number of years. What are some of the biggest challenges and what are some of the lessons that you've learned during that period, Ebony?
Yes, so for St. Louis Recast, I would say one of the biggest lessons or challenges that we had was really understanding, and it's important for you all too, to understand what your internal procurement and legal processes are, because that can really affect your timeline and your process. This is speaking about, democratic processes. Traditionally, the community is not the one that's deciding how public dollars are allocated. So marrying this really legal process with a very community-centered process wasn't always the easiest, but we found ways to work around it and really kind of challenging, that idea of the lowest bid being what we should go with, and kind of trying to recenter it that it's like, no, what community says we need is what we should go with. And so for us, some of those things may have looked like changing around like the actual dollar amount that was being awarded. Because if our procurement process took longer than we expected, maybe we realized organizations may not have as much time to actually use the money to implement their process. So if we had smaller amounts of money, then they would have more time to do that. And then also too, with the dollar amounts we learned, even from our community saying, hey, we wanted grassroots organizations to really be the ones that were centered. And so changing up that dollar amount really helped to be able to make sure that we were awarding funds that smaller organizations or grassroots organizations would have the capacity to be able to do their projects too.
Well, we could go on all day here, but I understand that our time is somewhat limited. It's been a really informative meeting. But even with all of the notes I've been able to take, I am sure that I'm not going to be able to remember all of this. How can other organizations such as mine that haven't been able to meet with you gurus how can they learn how to do all of this?
Yes, Craig, that is a great point. Thank you. What do you think organizations need to get started?
Well, maybe a toolkit.
A toolkit. That is a great idea. Craig, now my mind is really thinking about what exactly should we include in one, Shamika?
Well, in true spirit of participative approaches, we should ask for
stakeholder input. Yay! So we hope that you all enjoyed that skit and got a lot of information out of it. We are already right on that shelf over there. I'm gonna put my my Oscar, and Craig and Shamika, we have one for them as well. But towards the end, we said that we wanted to do a toolkit, and that in the true nature of not making decisions all on our own and doing what we think should be best, that we want to actually get stakeholder input on what it should be included in the toolkit, what organizations really feel like they need in order to get this process going for themselves, or maybe expand upon a process that they are already doing. And so at this time, we are going to open it up for any questions or comments as it relates to participatory budgeting or anything we've discussed this afternoon. And I'm also going to share in the chat box a link before you go to provide feedback and evaluation. And there's also space if you aren't able to share this afternoon on the call. There's also space in there for you to be able to indicate things that you would like to see or questions that you would like to have addressed within our toolkit, which really will be coming out this September. And so with that, I open it for any questions. And thank you so much, Peggy. And did anyone have any questions or would like to share? Feel free to type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself to let us know maybe any frequently asked questions, or when you think about participatory budgeting and possibly doing something like that within your own organization, or just getting the community more involved in the work that you may be doing, sort of any questions that you may have around that. Or on the flip side, if you already are, what we would love to hear from some of you about the work that you all may be doing already that centers community.
Well, Ebony, you must have perfectly explained all about participatory budgeting.
Yeah, and you asked some great questions, Craig. I think your organization is going to get off to a great start.
What should we start with first if we were thinking about doing this? Do we have to think about money? Do we have to think about a particular, what do you think we should think about first if we just wanted to start with a participatory process?
Yeah, I think one of the two first things would be, like you said, identifying the source of money possibly to be able to do that. So whether there's all different types of, pots of money that could be used, or really getting innovative with the pots of money that we may already have access to. So whether it's through a grant that maybe there it's intended for community work, and just rethinking about, how can we involve community in in this process that we're already doing, or whether it's partnering with other institutions or elected officials, or even that have funds or discretionary funds that they have that leeway to bring the community in to distribute. And then once that process is kind of, identified, I would say the next part is really seeking to identify who is this intended or ideally intended to benefit, and how can we, instead of us making those decisions, how do we go about bringing those community members that are part of that group to the table to be a part of this process?
Yeah, thanks for that. I know that we did a lot of it where it was primarily, at least there was a vote and so forth, but we also had a real consensus process, right? So people could feel either really strongly that they disagreed with something or strongly in favor of it, and sort of people were giving and taking so that it wasn't just a majority vote, right?
Yes, in the community meetings. And so prior to residents actually meeting in their different groups, we did do the facilitative leadership training that really focused on consensus building, and what do we do when we don't agree, or what about if we're split? How do we make sure those ideas all come together and is represented? So that was something that prior to even meeting, we kind of did that foundational work so that residents were already coming to the meetings from that perspective of, okay, how are we going to come together and recognize the fact that there's going to be several great ideas here. How do we go about different ways to come to a consensus or merge ideas together?
Yeah, and I really think that preparation is so really very important, because we all sort of come to these things with an agenda. Maybe we want a particular playground equipment or whatever, but thinking more generally and learning about those issues like the trauma informed and the racial equity and the broader, more holistic view of what it is that we're trying to do sometimes break some of that down, I think, right?
Yes, I would say that it's definitely a big piece of it. And then the cool thing I think about participatory budgeting and participative approaches in general, in the skit, Shamika talked about those benefits and the transparency, the increase in civic engagement, the opportunities to really, incorporate non-traditional voices in the process, and also that emphasis on youth. And when we think about civic engagement and voting and things of that nature, for all populations for a variety of reasons if they aren't able to participate in elections. It gives another opportunity for people to still have a direct say in things that are going on and impacting their community. So whether that be because of their age, whether it be because of their citizenship or justice involvement, or maybe, experiences that just they don't decide to go out and vote. It could be an opportunity to foster that and build that connection to community, and taking back that ownership to really charge into other areas. And so as organizations, I think it's really important to highlight and kind of challenge, the traditional ways and rethink. And as Rachel spoke of, may call for, difficult or different conversations internally to be able to make these types of processes and steps actually happen.
So back into character, Shamika, here comes a question your way. You wanna tell us a little bit more about some of those benefits that participatory budgeting or the participatory process provides that we didn't really get a chance to talk about so much? Not to put you on the spot, but to put you on the spot.
Yes. So providing, the community voice, really making sure that the community voice is heard on what services are needed, what those services will look like, and also just designing as well, and that it's representing from youth all the way into adulthood, and as mentioned, transparency as well, and just building those relationships.
Thank you.
Yes, and so I hope that everyone really enjoyed this afternoon. And so, you know, of those different sustainability pillars that we have, as the grant comes to an end. Oh, I see one question. I want to answer that before, Miss Jackie asked, how do you get people to be involved in the first place, especially when they think it is for someone not in their group? And so, I think that's a great question. And I think, one of the big parts or how that can be done is really on the beginning with the raising awareness and informing people. Engagement really happens on a spectrum. Recast is pretty cool that it kind of hits all the parts of that spectrum, but the beginning, that raising awareness and informing the community, especially the community that you're seeking to engage, centering them in that portion, really helps to get that connection and lets people know the different roles that there are for them to be a part of. Because sometimes, especially traditionally, people may just assume that, you know, the other people or the powers that be are will handle this stuff. So there takes that part in the beginning to really raise awareness and let people know of those roles, and maybe even going to, where the people are, to some to really let them know, like, hey, they showed up at the this place that they might not have been expecting to see you, and can engage people that way too, especially for, like you mentioned, Miss Jackie, um, the non-traditional voices. And then also utilizing community champions, to forge those relationships and be a part of the process. Because maybe the organization, especially if it's newer, may not have that rapport just yet. But if there's someone within that community or within that group that's can be act as like a gatekeeper, or that's trusted to say, like, hey, these are good people over here, this is cool work, that could also be another way, to kind of build that trust, and for people to be like, okay, I'll give this a try.
Yeah, Ebony, yeah, I agree with that. I um, think that there is healthy skepticism. Obviously, we encountered that, and if people have some other ideas about how we do that and can do that, and others can do that better, I think we would enjoy hearing about that to include in the toolkit. Absolutely. I think what happens is it doesn't matter what we say, it doesn't matter any of that. In when people start seeing that it makes a difference, that in fact what their brainchild was, in fact, becomes part of the process, and their project is on the map, and then someone is found, and the people that they voted for are in fact putting those into practice in the community. I think that's all really helpful. But yeah, those champions are really, really, really critical.
Thank you, Craig. And so it is 4:30, and we definitely thank all of you for joining us. Again, in the chat box is a link to do the feedback form, which also has space for you all to indicate different things to help us shape out our toolkit so that organizations are able to implement their own participatory budgeting process. And so we'd really be grateful for your input and feedback on that form. That link is in the chat box and will also be shared when this recording is sent out. And I also want to take this time to invite you all. This is a 3-part series. And so next Tuesday, same time, same place, on the 15th, we will be continuing this conversation with talking about the importance of collaboration and working together, not working in those silos, and how partnership is really important, and how to foster new partnerships, and really what true collaboration looks like across systems and across organizations. And so we really hope that you are able to join us for that on the 15th to really tie in with our system connections sustainability efforts. And then on the 29th, then we'll wrap up this series with a capacity building workshop around grant writing. And so we really hope that you all are able to join us for that. And that will tie in with our community networking, sustainability efforts, and a little bit of that economic mobility as well. And so I really thank you all for joining us. And so hope to see you next Tuesday.